Chapter 9. Black Snake Colony Member. Nancy was too far away from the car to see its driver's or license plate. Thoughtfully, she went to bed, but lay awake for some time, feeling completely baffled over the many mysterious happenings. By morning, she felt eager for action. Ever since her arrival at Redgate Farm, Nancy had wanted to visit the cavern on the hillside. The strange moonlight ceremony and the unidentified car which had hesitated in front of the house only intensified her interest in the place. She broached the subject of a visit there to Mrs. Bird, but Joanne's grandmother frowned on the idea. "I'll worry if you go," she said. "Those folks are probably harmless, but we don't know much about them. I wish now I had never rented the land. The neighbors are saying I was foolish to do it in the first place." "And so you were," Mrs. Salisbury, who had overheard the conversation, chimed in. "You'll ruin the value of your farm. Why, people around are saying dreadful things about the members of the cult. Even Reuben is afraid to go near the place." "I'm not," Nancy announced. "I think it would be fun to investigate." Mrs. Salisbury snorted. "Fun! Girls these days have strange ideas of fun. First thing you know, Mrs. Bird, she'll be wanting to join the colony." "Nonsense," Mrs. Bird smiled. In order to avoid further discussion, Nancy dropped the subject of the cave. But that afternoon, she set out alone on a hike, making her way to the woods, which skirted the river. Nancy struck a well-worn path and decided to continue along it. She had only walked a short way when the sound of a faint cry came to her. Nancy halted in the path and listened intently. The cry was not repeated. "Maybe I imagined it," she said to herself. Nevertheless, Nancy quickened her pace, looking about her as she walked. As she rounded a bend a few minutes later, she was startled to see a woman hunched over on the ground, writhing in pain. "What's the matter?" Nancy cried out, hurrying over to her. Then the girl's eyes widened. This was the woman she had seen running across the field the night of the storm. "I tripped on a root in the path," the woman murmured, rocking back and forth in pain. "My ankle, it's broken." Nancy dropped to one knee and quickly examined the injured ankle. It was swelling rapidly, but all the bones seemed to be in place. "See if you can stand," she advised. With Nancy's help, the woman managed to get to her feet, but winced as she tried to take her first step. "It isn't broken," Nancy said gently, "but you have a bad sprain." "Oh, what'll I do now?" the woman moaned. "Do you live far from here?" Nancy asked. The stranger looked at her rather queerly and did not answer at once. Nancy thought she had not understood, so she repeated the question. About a quarter of a mile up the river, was the mumbled response. I'll get there all right. You're scarcely able to walk in step, Nancy said with a troubled frown. Please let me run back to the farm and bring help. No, the woman protested, clutching Nancy fearfully by the arm. I don't want to be a bother to anyone. Nonsense. You shouldn't be walking at all. It won't take me a minute to get someone to help you. The woman shook her head stubbornly. My foot feels better now. I can walk by myself. She started off, but nearly collapsed by the time she had taken 3 steps. If you won't let me go for help, then at least let me take you home. Again, the woman protested, but Nancy took hold of her arm and placed it over her shoulder. With Nancy's support, the woman made slow and painful progress up the path. This is killing you, Nancy said, dismayed that the woman was so foolishly stubborn. I can get our hired man to carry you. No, the woman objected vehemently. Her unwillingness to accept help puzzled Nancy. As they made their way slowly along, she became aware that her companion's distress was not entirely due to pain, but partially to Nancy's own presence. This mystified Nancy, but she could not turn back as long as she knew the woman really needed her. I don't remember seeing any houses along the river, Nancy said after a time. You're not a member of the nature cult, are you? A half-cynical expression crossed the woman's face, then one of sadness. Yes, she returned quietly. I'm one of the members. Nancy took time to scrutinize her companion more carefully than before. She wore a blue gingham dress which was plain and durable, and certainly did not appear to be a costume. The woman did not speak or act as Nancy imagined a member of a cult would. She seemed like any other person. It must be healthful to live an outdoor life, Nancy remarked, feeling that some comment was necessary. I've often looked over at your tents and thought I should like to visit the colony sometime. The woman stopped abruptly in the path and faced Nancy with an odd look on her face. You must never come near. Why not? It wouldn't be safe. Not safe? Nancy echoed in astonishment. I don't understand. I mean, the members of the cult don't want folks prying around. The woman said hastily. I see. The rites are secret. That's it, the woman said in obvious relief. But why couldn't I visit the colony sometime when ceremonies aren't being held? Nancy persisted. You mustn't come near the hillside, ever, the stranger warned. The two continued up the path, To Nancy, it was apparent that her questions had disturbed the woman. For several times, she caught her looking distressed and worried. As she approached the hillside, and before they were within sight of the tents, the woman stopped short. "Thank you for your help," she said quietly. "I can make it alone from here." Nancy hesitated. The woman's firm tone told her it would do no good to protest. She was not going to let Nancy come any nearer the camp. At least let me find something that you can use as a cane," Nancy said. She searched along the path and found a branch that was strong enough. The woman accepted it gratefully. Her face softened, and she stood for an instant, looking intently at Nancy. "You're a good girl to help a stranger like me. I wish—" The woman turned away abruptly. "Remember," she advised sternly over her shoulder, "don't ever come near the camp." Still perplexed, Nancy watched the woman hobble away. It took her a long time to reach the top of the hill, but at last she disappeared from sight. "I can't understand why the poor thing acted the way she did," Nancy said to herself as she sat down on a log to think. "What harm could it have done if I'd gone with her to the colony? The cult must have some very important secrets." The more Nancy considered the matter, the more baffled she became. The woman didn't look as though being a member of the Black Snake colony made her very happy, Nancy thought. If they're so afraid that someone will discover their secrets, they must be doing more than just flitting at night in white robes. Maybe that's only to keep people from guessing what really goes on there. As Nancy reached this startling conclusion, she jumped up and walked briskly toward Redgate Farm. "There's one thing certain," she said to herself with a chuckle. Now that the woman has forbidden me to go near the camp, I can't resist finding out what's happening there." Nancy was just approaching the farmhouse when she heard the phone ringing. She hurried inside and answered it. "Yes, this is Nancy Drew," she replied to a strange man's question. "One moment." While Nancy waited, she wondered who the caller might be. Was someone going to threaten her to desist in her detective work? Oh, she said, as the next speaker announced himself as Chief McGinnis. A sense of relief came over the girl. "I have some news, Nancy," the officer said. "It's discouraging. Nothing on the code or the missing men." Then he chuckled. "We need another clue from you." Nancy realized her old friend was teasing. Glad to help, she said gaily. "What's the assignment?" "To find out where the health syndics moved to after they left room 305. "Then that was their headquarters," Nancy cried excitedly. "Temporarily. But they left no forwarding address," the police chief said. "If we could decipher the rest of the code, we might be able to trace them," Nancy said. "Anyhow, I'll be on the lookout for clues. At least, it shouldn't be too hard to find Yvonne Wan." Chief McGinnis agreed and assured Nancy he would let her know if there were any new developments. Then he asked, And what are you doing? Any mysteries up your way?"
"There might be," she told him the little she had been able to glean about the mysterious nature cult. She described the unusual moonlight ceremonies the girls had witnessed and the appearance of the identified car. The police chief whistled in amazement.
Sounds as though you do have another mystery up your sleeves. Have you come across any possible clues to what the cult is worshipping, Nancy?"
The detective hesitated for a moment, telling Chief McGinnis about her curious conversation with the woman she had assisted in the woods. She decided to mention it and added that although the woman had readily admitted to being a member of the cult, she had given Nancy no reason for her firm warning to stay away from the meeting place.
"Black Snake Colony, huh?" the police chief said reflectively.
"Yes," Nancy replied. "Have you ever heard of it?"
"No, but let me look in a report we have here on all cults. I'll be right back."
Nancy waited eagerly for the phone to ring. When it did, she snatched up the receiver.
"The Black Snake Colony is not listed," Chief McGinnis told her.
"You mean it's a phony?" Nancy asked excitedly. Chapter 10. Plan of Attack. Chief McGinnis refused to comment on the possibility that the Black Snake Colony might be a phony group.
"They may not have been in existence long enough to be known," he replied. "But you might try to find out what you can and let me know."
"I'll do that," the young detective agreed. After Nancy had put down the phone, she reflected for a long time on the new twist to the hillside mystery, then walked out to the front porch where Mrs. Salisbury and Mr. Abbott and the three girls were seated. Nancy had not planned to tell them of her experience, but her face was so animated it revealed her thoughts. They besieged her with questions until finally she revealed her meeting with the woman of the strange nature cult. "Told you not to come near, did she?" Mrs. Salisbury cackled. "Well, I hope you intend to follow her advice." Nancy laughed and shook her head. "I'm more interested than ever in what's going on up there on the hillside. I'm ready for a little adventure right about now." "So am I," George chimed in. Joanne nodded vigorously, while Bess, always more cautious, agreed rather half-heartedly.
"Better stay away,"
Mr. Albert advised, for once not contradicting Mrs. Salisbury. "You can't tell what may be going on there." Nancy was tempted to comment, but instead she forced a smile and said, "It seems to me that this matter may be of deep concern to Jo and her grandmother, if not to me." Mrs. Bird had stepped onto the porch in time to get the gist of the conversation, and at once spoke up. "I think Nancy's right," she declared thoughtfully. "Of course, I don't want the girls to go looking for trouble, but I'm beginning to think someone ought to investigate those mysterious people.
If anything questionable is going on, I want to know about it. I'll ask the Black Snake Colony to move out, even if I do lose the rent. Why, I might get into trouble myself if they stay."
Mr. Albert and Mrs. Salisbury fell into an injured silence. Nancy gave her friends a sly wink, and a few minutes later they all quietly withdrew to the spring house to discuss their plans. Here she told the girls about her conversation with Chief McGinnis. "Something peculiar is going on at those cult meetings, I'm sure," Nancy went on, "and I must find out about them if I can. Do you all want to join me in the investigation?" "Of course," Joanne and George said. "Do you think it'll be safe?" Bess asked. "I'm not making any rash promises," Nancy laughed. Bess gave a little shiver. "I don't like it, but count me in." "How can we visit the colony without being caught?" George said. "That's the problem," Nancy replied. "We must make our plans carefully. Before we do anything, I suggest we find out about the robes the cult members wear. We may need to wear similar ones to help us in our investigation." "There's only one way to find out," Joanne said. "Some night when they're having ceremonial meetings, we can sneak through the woods and try to get a closer look at what's going on." Nancy nodded excitedly. "The double entrance to the cave will be perfect," she said. If we can't sneak into the meetings any other way, we can get into the cave at the end they don't use." "Sounds terribly risky to me," Bess commented. "Oh, for Pete's sake," George said scornfully. "Don't be such a wet blanket, Bess." Her cousin opened her mouth to retort, but Nancy interposed quickly to forestall any further argument. "We'd better not tell our plan to anyone except your grandmother, Joe," she advised. "Otherwise, Mrs. Salisbury and Mr. Albert will try to talk her out of letting us investigate." After a light supper and some rather forced conversation on trivial matters, the girls retired. They had tried to keep silent about the activities of the nature cult, but their secretive manner did not escape the notice of Mrs. Salisbury and Mr. Albert. "You're up to something," Mrs. Salisbury remarked the next morning, "and if I were Mrs. Bird, I'd stop it at once." Mrs. Bird, however, went on sincerely with her work, being careful not to interfere with the girls' plans. They maintained a close watch of the hillside, but for 2 days seldom saw anyone in the vicinity. "I think they've holed in for the rest of the summer," George declared impatiently at breakfast. Either that or they've moved out. The cult's still here," Joanne assured her. "The rent check arrived in the morning mail. By the way, where do these nature people get their food?" Nancy queried. "They can't live on blue sky and inspiration." "I think friends must bring food to them in automobiles," Joanne answered. "Several times I've seen swanky cars drive up and park near the hillside." "The cult members must be fairly well off then," Nancy said thoughtfully. I'm getting tired of marking time. I wish something would happen soon. If it doesn't, I think I'll investigate that cave anyway. That night the girls were late in finishing the dishes. By the time they had put everything away, it was quite dark. When they went out to the porch, they were relieved to find that the boarders had gone to their rooms. The girls sat quietly for some time. The moon was high, and Nancy, from force of habit, glanced eagerly toward the distant hill. "Look, girls!" she exclaimed. "They're at it again." The four girls could see white objects moving to and fro, apparently going through a weird ritual. Nancy sprang to her feet. "We'll have to hurry if we want to see anything," she said. "Come on. We'll take the shortcut." They dashed across the lawn and flung open the gate and ran through the woods. Nancy led the way up the river path, then to the sparsely wooded hillside. Not until they were close to the camp did she stop. "We'll have to be very careful," she warned in a whisper. "Scatter and hide behind the trees, and don't make a sound." The girls obeyed. Bess staying as close to George as possible. Nancy found a huge oak tree well up the hills and hid behind it. From this vantage point, she could see fairly well. Nancy had been there for less than 5 minutes when she heard the sound of several cars approaching. They came up the woods road and stopped at the foot of the hill, not far from the nature camp. Several men stepped from the cars. Nancy was too far away to see their faces, but she did observe that they quickly donned long white robes with head masks and joined the other costumed figures who were on the brow of the hill. For nearly 10 minutes, the members of the cult flitted back and forth, waving their arms and making weird noises. Then they moved single file toward the cavern and vanished. Suddenly Nancy felt herself grasped by an arm. She wheeled sharply, then laughed softly. "George, for goodness sake, don't ever do that again. You scared me silly." "What do you make of it, Nancy?" "It's the strangest thing I've ever seen. I haven't been able to figure it out." "What should we do next?" asked Bess, who had joined them. "Let's follow them into the cave," George proposed rashly. "And be caught?" Nancy returned. "No, this is serious business. I think it's time to go home and plan our own costumes." "I wonder why so many people came here in automobiles," Joanne mused as the girls walked off slowly. "That's what I've been wondering," Nancy replied somberly. "But I think I might know." "Why?" her friends demanded. "It looks to me as if only a few persons are actually living in the Black Snake colony. Apparently, they want to give the impression that the organization is a large one, so they have these other people come the night set for the ceremonials. There were certainly a lot of men in those cars," added Bess. "Why should they go to all that trouble?" Joanne asked doubtfully. "I don't know," Nancy admitted, "unless it's because they're trying to hide something they're doing here." She changed the subject. "I think we'll be able to make our costumes like theirs, if you'll give us some old pillowcases and sheets. Joe?" When When can we visit the cave? We must disguise. When we visit the cave, we must disguise ourselves to make our scheme work. Chapter 11. A Midnight Message. When shall we visit the cave? George asked. As soon as we can, Nancy answered. Of course, we must help Jo and her grandmother with the work. Since there was no further evidence of activity on the hillside, the girls went to bed. Excuse me. The next morning, George remarked as she helped Nancy make her bed, "What do you suppose those men do between ceremonials? It certainly is strange how much time they spent in that cave."
What puzzles me is those automobiles that were on the hillside, Bess said. Why did they come? Surely those men were here for something besides ballet dancing. What's your guess, Nancy?
I'm afraid I haven't any answer, but I mean to find one for Mrs. Bird's and Jo's sake. Three girls learned that Reuben was due to be absent most of the day and offered to do his chores. Excuse me. During the morning, they picked cherries and took them to the town to sell at the local market. When they returned, a small, strange car was standing in the driveway. Loud voices were coming from the living room. "I don't have to sell, and I won't," Mrs. Bird said with finality in her tone. "That's what you think," said a man with a sincerely. Is it really? Sneeringly. No, it's sneeringly. "You're going to lose this farm, and I can buy it cheaper from the bank. Why don't you sell it to me and make a little profit? Then you can go to the city and take life easy." "We don't want to go to the city," Joanne spoke up. "We're getting along all right here. More boarders are coming soon, and we're paying off our back mortgage interest, so we won't have to sell." Outside, Nancy, Bess, and George looked at one another. The insistent buyer again. Fervently, they hoped that Mrs. Bird would not weaken in her decision. A moment later, they felt relieved. "I will say good afternoon." "I will say good afternoon, Mr. Kent," Mrs. Bird said. "Thank you for your offer, but I can not accept it." "You'll be sorry. You'll regret this." The caller stormed. He came out the screen door, slamming it viciously behind him. Nancy stared in surprise. Mr. Kent certainly was one of the most ill-mannered men she had ever seen, and also, she thought Wyerley one of the most tenacious. Why was he so determined to buy the Bird home? Mr. Kent, his face red with anger, stepped into his car and sped off, but not before he gave Nancy and her friends a baleful look. "Nice disposition," George commented sarcastically.
"I hope he never shows up again,"
Bess said firmly. The girls found Mrs. Bird and Joanne quite shaken. "I can't understand that man's persistence," the woman said. Nancy was sure the matter was tied in with the cult on the hillside,
but did not mention this theory. She merely said, "Try not to worry about Mr. Kent. I doubt that he'll return." Soon the incident was forgotten, as preparations for supper were started and the farm animals were fed. George elected to take care of gathering eggs from the hen house. Bess gave the horse hay and water. "I'll get the cow," Nancy offered, and went off toward the pasture to drive Primrose in. But the cow was not there. Nancy walked around the fence surrounding the field to see if there was an opening and through which the animal might have wandered. Finally she found one, and saw hoofprints leading toward the patch of woods. Nancy dashed off among the trees. She had never been that way before, but there was only one path to follow. Several times she paused to listen, and though she heard a faint tinkling of a cowbell somewhere ahead of her, it was rapidly growing dusky in the woods, and Nancy hurried on. Again she stopped to listen. She could hear the cowbell distinctly now. Primrose can't be far ahead, she thought in relief, and went in that direction. Nancy finally caught sight of the Jersey contentedly munching grass on the hillside beyond. Nancy stopped short and gave a gasp of astonishment. The sound of the cowbell had brought her to the mouth of the cave. "I can hardly believe it," she almost exclaimed aloud. "This must be the other opening near the nature camp Joe told me about." Eagerly, Nancy rushed toward the cave, but no sooner had she peered into the dark entrance than she was startled by the crackling of a twig behind her. Nancy wheeled to find a man standing not 3 feet away from her. He seemed to have risen from the bushes, which half hid the opening from the cave. Instantly it flashed through Nancy's mind that he had been stationed there to see that intruders did not enter. "What are you doing here?" he asked in his voice as cold as steel. Nancy recoiled. The man stood in the shadows of the shrubbery so that she could not see his face distinctly, but at the sound of his voice she knew instantly she was in danger. "I must persuade him I wasn't spying," she thought desperately. "Better speak up!" The man snarled. "What are you doing here, girlie?" I was hunting for that cow," Nancy replied as casually as possible. She pointed to the Jersey, which was grazing a short distance away. She held her ground defiantly. There was a moment's silence. Nancy could feel that the man was staring at her, as if undecided whether or not to believe her. "So, you were after the cow?" the lookout growled. "Then why are you by this cave?" "Why, I was just wondering what was inside," Nancy said innocently. "Surely there's no harm in looking." "You've no business around here," the man snapped. "This property belongs to the members of the Black Snake Colony." "Oh!" Nancy exclaimed in pretended awe. "Then you must belong to the colony. How very interesting." The man made no response to Nancy's remark. Instead, he muttered, "Round up that old cow of yours and get out of here. And don't come trespassing again." Nancy knew that she would gain nothing by arguing. Obediently, she overtook the cow and headed her back toward Redgate. The man watched until Nancy disappeared into the woods. As soon as she had started the cow down the path, however, Nancy quietly retraced her steps. She reached the edge of the woods just in time to catch a glimpse of the man entering the cave. That proves he's one of the Black Snake group, she told herself. He was acting as a guard for them. For an instant, Nancy was tempted to follow, but common sense told her not to press her luck. The lookout seemed determined enough to make trouble for her if she took the chance. Reluctantly, the young sleuth turned back toward the farm. It was clear to Nancy that the entire business of the Black Snake group was anything but open and above board. Obviously, they were afraid that some of the country folk would attempt to investigate. Then Nancy finally reached the barn, and Joanne began to milk Primrose. The other girls plied their friend with questions. "We were beginning to worry," Joanne said in relief. I wouldn't have let you go alone if I'd known this cow of ours would stray so far." "I'm glad I went," Nancy said quickly. She told the others what had taken place near the mouth of the cave. They gasped in astonishment upon hearing of her encounter with the lookout. "Weren't you frightened when he sprang up from out of nowhere?" Bess asked, giving Nancy an admiring glance. I'd have fainted on spot. That's an easy way out. That's an easy way out if I ever heard one," Nancy commented with a laugh. "Girls don't faint these days," George scoffed. "Probably you'd have screamed and brought all the members down on you. They'd have dragged you off and put an end to you." "Thanks, George," Bess muttered. "You say the nicest things." "Well, girls, talk all you like," Nancy added, "but don't lose your nerve altogether. I still want to get a closer look at that cave." "Not tonight," Bess said firmly. Nancy smiled. "I hope there won't be a ritual on the hillside tonight. We've been too busy to get our costumes ready." The girls watched, but the distant landscape remained dark. Finally, they went to bed. Not long afterwards, Nancy was aroused from a fitful slumber by the stopping of a car not far from her window. She hopped from the bed and went to peer out. A tall, slender woman who wore her hair piled high was walking to the front door. Nancy leaned out the window and called. "What is it you wish?" "Nancy Drew. Is she here?" "Yes, I'm Nancy." "I have a letter for you." Nancy did not recognize the woman's voice, but she might be discussing it? Disgusting it? Disguising it. There we go. "From whom?" "Your father." "Why are you bringing it now?" "It's an urgent message," the strange woman said. "I'll leave it on the doorstep." She dropped the letter, hurried into the car, and the man at the wheel drove off. Heart pounding, Nancy put on her robe and slippers and hurried down to the front door. Chapter 12. Secret Service Agents. The stopping of the car at the house had awakened Mrs. Bird, who slept on the first floor. She met Nancy in the hall and asked what was happening. Quickly, Nancy told her, then opened the door. On the porch lay a plain envelope with Nancy's name typed on it. "This seems a peculiar way for your father to get in touch with you," Mrs. Bird remarked. "Why didn't he just phone if it's urgent?" I don't understand it myself," Nancy answered as she tore the letter. The message was typewritten and was succinct. Nancy was to return home at once. Her father needed her. She was not to try to communicate with him. He could not explain why. It was signed, Dad. Nancy read the letter to Mrs. Bird. Oh, I couldn't let you start out at this time of night alone, the woman said at once. "You must wait until morning." "The whole thing doesn't seem like Dad," Nancy reflected. "He wouldn't send a terse note like this, even if he were in some kind of trouble." Mrs. Bird was very much concerned. "It seems to me he would have called you on the phone in an emergency," she offered thoughtfully. "Yes," Nancy agreed. "That's why this puzzles me so. But don't you worry about it, Mrs. Bird. This is something I'll have to try to figure out myself." "But my dear," Mrs. Bird repeated, "it's impossible for you to do anything about it at this hour." Nancy carefully studied the note. Suddenly she became aware of a familiar scent of perfume. The young detective held the envelope to her nostrils. It had been handled by someone who used the distinctive blue jade scent, which Bess had purchased. Instantly, Nancy was alerted. "It wouldn't surprise me, Mrs. Bird, if this letter was a phony. I'm going to call Dad, even though it's an unearthly hour to waken him." She picked up the receiver in the hall. No sound reached her ears. "I'm afraid the line is dead," she told Mrs. Bird. "Does this happen often?" "It has never happened before," Mrs. Bird said. "I made a call after supper, and everything was all right then." Nancy stood in perplexed silence. Had her father tried to get her, found the line out of order, then given the note to the couple? The woman might have carried the letter in a handbag which contained a purse-sized bottle of the Oriental perfume. In that case, I ought to start for River Heights, she thought. But a feeling of suspicion about the whole thing overpowered her. It might be a trap. The telephone line could have been cut. One or more persons might try to capture her on the road. But why? Nancy asked herself repeatedly. She came to the conclusion that the Hale Syndicate was back of the incident. They must have found out she had reported her suspicions to the police and somehow had learned where she was staying. She turned to Mrs. Bird and said, "I'll wait until 7 o'clock, then try the phone again. If it still isn't working, I'll go to town and call my dad." "Thank you, dear." Mrs. Bird patted Nancy on the shoulder. "But don't you go anywhere alone. Take Bess and George with you." "I will." Promptly at 7 o'clock, Nancy tried to get in touch with her father, but the phone still was not working. Joanne was already up, but Nancy roused Bess and George. The three girls were astonished to learn about the note. "We'll get breakfast in town," Nancy told Mrs. Bird as she prepared to drive off with her friends. "And if I don't have to go to River Heights, I can do your shopping too. Suppose you give me the list?" Halfway to town, George said suddenly, "Nancy, isn't your gasoline tank nearly empty?" Nancy nodded. "I'm glad you reminded me. Watch for a station and we'll stop." Presently, Bess sighted one on the main road. "It's the same place we stopped to eat on our way to the farm," she said.
"So it is," George remarked.
"I can phone from here," Nancy decided. She turned in the gravel driveway, but as two other cars were ahead of her, she drew up some distance from the pump. "How about getting breakfast here after you phone?" Bess suggested. The girls agreed. Bess and George entered the lunchroom while Nancy went to an outdoor phone booth. She had her father on the wire in a few moments. "Dad, did you send me a note last night?"
"Why, no."
Quickly, his daughter explained her question. The lawyer said grimly, "It's plain to see someone wants to harm you in one way or another. Please be careful." Nancy promised and said, Anyway, I'm glad you're all right." After Nancy hung up, she dialed the phone company to report that the Bird line was out of order. A few minutes later, she had joined Bess and George at a table and whispered the result of the conversation with Mr. Drew. "Oh, Nancy, this means you're in danger," Bess said worriedly. I thought at least I'd be safe at Redgate Farm," Nancy said. "I wonder," George muttered. The girls were the only customers in the restaurant. No one came to wait on them from an inner room, evidently used as an office. They could hear excited voices. "Something's wrong," Nancy said to her companions. Just then, two men came out of the office in company with the gas station attendant and the woman who served as the waitress of the restaurant. The woman was talking excitedly. "We found a $20 bill in the cash register at the end of the day. It looks like any other money, and we didn't expect anything was wrong until John took the day's receipts to the bank. And of all things, they said the bill was counterfeit, and they'd have to turn it over to the Secret Service."
"Yes," one of the agents spoke up. "We've just come back from the bank, and it's a counterfeit." "All right. There's been a lot of this bad money passed lately. The forgery is very clever."
What am I going to do?" the woman cried. "We were cheated out of $20. It isn't fair to hard-working people like John and me. Aren't you Secret Service agents going to do something about it?"
"We're doing all we can," one of the men replied. "We don't have much to go on."
"It was a girl who gave me the bill."
the woman explained. There were several of them in the party. I'd recognized... Oh! She shrieked. There's the very girl! She pointed an accusing finger at Nancy Drew. Nancy and her friends stared in astonishment. They could not believe what they had just heard. Arrest that girl! The woman screamed. Don't let any of them get away! They're all in on it together! Just a minute. One of the agents said, Suppose you explain, he suggested to Nancy. The excited woman, however, was not to be calmed. She rushed towards Nancy and shook her fist at the girl. Don't deny you gave me that phony bill, she screamed. I neither deny nor affirm it, Nancy said, turning to the agents. I did give the woman a $20 bill, but how do you know it was the counterfeit? It was the only 20 we took. It was the only 20 we took in that day, the waitress retorted. Nancy's thoughts raced. I'll take your word for it, she said quietly. Opening her purse, she took out another $20 bill. The woman snatched the money and handed it to one of the Secret Service. Is it good? She said crisply. The agent examined the bill. Then he looked at Nancy. Where did you get this? From my father. He gave me both bills. As a matter of fact, one was for car emergencies. Instead of giving the bill to the woman, the man put it into his pocket. This is serious business, young lady. The bill you just gave me is also counterfeit. Nancy was thunderstruck. Bess and George gasped. Before any of them could speak, the lunchroom lady cried out, She's one of the gang! Arrest her! For the first time, the station attendant spoke up. Take it easy, Liz. These girls don't exactly look like counterfeiters. Liz sniffed. People don't usually go around paying for Sundays with $20 bills, she said tartly. My father gave me the money because I was going on vacation. A likely story, the woman sneered. It's the truth, George spoke up indignantly. The idea of accusing my friend of passing a bad money on purpose? It's ridiculous. Ridiculous, is it? The woman retorted angrily. You'll sing a different tune when you're in jail. You can't have Nancy arrested. She didn't realize it was counterfeit money, Bess protested. George and I have some cash. We'll pay you $20 good dollars to make up for the bad ones. As the cousins pooled their funds and handed over the money, the woman quieted down. Maybe I was a little hasty, she admitted, but she was not entirely cowed. How about your father? She asked Nancy. How come he had counterfeit bills? How come he had counterfeit bills? Nancy said. She did not know, but certainly he had not
acquired them dishonestly. One of the Secret Servicemen said, "Suppose you tell us who you are and..."
I'll tell you who she is," came an authoritative voice from the doorway.
Chapter 13. A hesitant hitchhiker. Unobserved by the girls, an automobile had driven up and parked near the filling station. A tall young man had alighted and started for the lunchroom. Upon hearing the amazing conversation inside, he had halted, then realized Nancy was in need of help. He had stepped inside. "Carl!" Nancy cried out. She had never before been so glad to see anyone. It looks as if I just got here in the nick of time." Carl Albert Jr. smiled. "They're trying to arrest us!" Bess exclaimed. "You're kidding!" Carl cried in astonishment. "It's no joke," Nancy returned earnestly, then told him of her predicament. "Look here," Carl said bluntly, turning to the two Secret Service agents. "You can't hold these girls." "Who are you?" One of the agents demanded. My name is Carl Albert, and these girls are friends of mine. As it happens, my father is living at Redgate Farm in Round Valley, where they are also staying. I was on my way there when I thought I might stop in for a bite. Luckily, I did too. These girls may be friends of yours."
"These girls may be friends of yours," the unpleasant woman spoke up shrilly. "But this girl had better explain why she gave me counterfeit money."
If you're accusing these girls of deliberately trying to pass counterfeit money, you're crazy!" Carl Albert cried out. "You're willing to vouch for the honesty of this young lady's father as well?" the agent asked. "Most definitely. This is Nancy Drew. No doubt you've heard of her father, the famous lawyer. If you haven't, you soon will." "Not Carson Drew of River Heights?" "Yes," Carl replied. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" the restaurant owner asked. "You didn't give me a chance to tell you anything," Nancy retorted. And you didn't seem ready to believe what I did have to say." The two agents looked at each other. One asked to see Nancy's driver's license. Then, with a smile, he said, Too bad you have such a loss because of the counterfeit money. The outfit which is distributing the $20 bills is a clever one. The money is turning up in many places. I'll get in touch with your father to find out where he was given the bills. Incidentally, we understand a few women are mixed up in the racket. That's why we detained you." "Let's get out of here," George urged. The girls hurriedly left the lunchroom with Carl. The government agents leisurely followed them outside. As Nancy was about to step into her car, she thought of something It occurred to her that by some remote chance the investigators might be interested in the phony message which she had brought with her. This may or may not have anything to do with the case, she told them, handing over the scented note. But the signature is a forgery, and the perfume has some mystery to it. She gave a brief account of her own involvement with the mystery, beginning with her encounter on the train and the man who had mentioned the chief, and ending with the code. If the rest of the code can be deciphered, Nancy concluded, that might give us the answer to everything, including the Hale's Signidate's whereabouts.
So you're the young detective Chief McGinnis mentioned in his report to us? One of the agents said admiringly. What you've done so far is really astounding. Chief McGinnis didn't mention you by name. He probably figured you would prefer him not to.
Your dictation seemed very sound.
Your dictation seemed very sound, Miss Drew, and I'd advise you to be careful. That Hale gang may think you know too much already. I'll take this note and pass it along to our handwriting expert. Perhaps Yvonne Wan was the person who delivered it.
Nancy shook her head. From what I could see of the woman, I know she wasn't Yvonne. After the agent had wished Nancy luck on the solution of the mystery, she said goodbye to the men, and with the others she went back to her car. Although Carl Albert was eager to continue onto Redgate Farm to see his father, he expressed concern about the three girls and their upsetting experience. He asked for a detailed account of the events which had led to Nancy's predicament. He was most interested and sympathetic when the girls told him the whole story.
Well, he said admiringly, I guess I won't worry too much about you girls. You certainly aren't easily daunted by emergencies.
After Carl Jr. and the trio had exchanged goodbyes, the young man got into his car and drove onto the farm. Bess turned to her companions. Where to? I'm more starved than ever. It's only a short way to town from here, Nancy replied. We can get breakfast there and then do our shopping. Soon the girls reached Round Valley. When they finished eating, Nancy looked at Mrs. Bird's list. There's really not much on it, she commented. 2 of us could do the shopping. Suppose you girls take over and I'll go buy the material for our costumes? Material? Bess queried. Nancy laughed. If we're going to join the Black Snake group in one of their rites, we'll need ghost costumes. And I've decided it wouldn't be fair to Mrs. Bird to ruin 4 of her sheets and pillowcases. Suddenly, George said, What are we going to use for money? Nancy had only $2. Bess and George, between them, counted 6. That will pay for meat and groceries, Bess said. I guess our costume material and the other errands will have to wait. The
food shopping was soon finished, and the girls returned to Redgate Farm. Joanne met them at the kitchen door. "Guess what?" she burst out. "The telephone repairman was here. He said our line had been cut." Nancy nodded. "By those people who were here last night." "I suppose so. Oh, Nancy, I'm so worried for you. And Carl Jr. tells us you've had another adventure this morning. He said you'd explain." Nancy, with lively interruptions from Bess and George, related the girls' recent experience. "I gave those Secret Service men the note and told them the Hale significant might be mixed up in some way with the counterfeiters. The syndicate may be the distributors of the phony bills." "Well, do let the authorities take care of it," Joanne urged. "I want you girls to have a good time while you're here." "Oh, I'm having a wonderful time," Nancy assured her. "By the way, I think we should work on our costumes for the hillside ceremony. Could you repay us the money we spent today so I can buy more material? We decided it isn't fair to use your grandmother's good linens." "Oh, yes, right away. I'll get it from Graham. And I think there are a few more groceries she needs." Joanne returned in a few minutes and handed over the money, to which she added enough for the marketing. Nancy headed for town. She had gone about a mile when she sighted a woman hurrying along the side of the road. She was limping slightly. "I'll offer her a ride," Nancy decided. She seems to be in a great hurry." She halted the car and called, "May I give you a lift to town?" The woman glanced up, startled. Nancy was surprised to see that she was the woman from the Black Snake colony whom she had helped several days before on the river trail. What she was doing so far from her camp, Nancy did not know. But she was determined to make the most of the opportunity at hand. "Please, get in," Nancy urged as the woman hesitated. "I'm sure your foot must be paining you. I noticed that you are still limping." "Thanks," the woman returned gratefully, hobbling over to the car door, which Nancy held open for her. "I am in a hurry to get to town." Before stepping inside, she looked quickly over her shoulder, as though fearing that someone might observe her actions. She sighed in relief and settled back, looking very pale and exhausted. "You weren't intending to walk all the way to town?" Nancy asked in a friendly, conversational tone. The woman nodded. I had to get there somehow. But aren't the members of your colony permitted to use any of the cars I've seen around the camp?" Nancy questioned, watching her company closely, and hoping that she might tactfully glean some information. "We aren't allowed such much freedom," the woman answered. "You shouldn't be walking on that foot yet," Nancy protested. "You're apt to injure your ankle permanently." "It's nearly well now," the woman told her, avoiding Nancy's eyes. "They didn't know at the camp that I was going to town. I left in a hurry. Again, the stranger cast of anxious glance over her shoulder. She obviously thinks she's being followed, Nancy thought to herself. Perhaps she's even running away. Nancy wanted to ask her companion a number of questions, but the woman's aloofness discouraged her. Deciding on an entirely different course, the young sleuth pretended not to pay particular attention to the woman. For some time they drove in long silence. Nancy could see that her passenger was gradually relaxing and losing her fear. "Am I driving too fast for you?" Nancy inquired, thinking the time was right to launch the conversation. "Oh, no," the woman returned quickly. "You can't go too fast for me." She hesitated, and then added, "I have an important letter to mail." "Why don't you drop it in one of the roadside mailboxes?" Nancy suggested casually. The rural carrier will pick it up and save you a long trip. I want to get it off this morning, if I possibly can. I'll be glad to go to the post office and mail it for you," Nancy said, purposely drawing the woman out. "Thank you, but no," the woman mumbled. I'd feel better if I did it myself." As Nancy did not reply, she said, "I don't mean to be ungrateful for all you've done. Really, I don't. It's only that I mustn't get you into trouble." "How could I get into trouble by helping you?" Nancy asked with a smile. "You don't understand," her companion replied nervously. "There are things I can't explain. The leaders of the colony will be very angry with me if they find I have left, even for a few hours, and especially that I've mailed this letter to my sister. The cult forbids communication with the outside world." "I can't understand why you tolerate such rigid supervision," Nancy said impatiently. "Why, the leader of the cult must treat you as prisoners." "You're not far from wrong," the woman confessed. "Then why don't you run away?" The question startled the woman. She glanced sharply at Nancy and then quickly looked away. "I would if I dared," she said finally. "Why don't you dare?" Nancy challenged. "I'll help you." "No, you mustn't get mixed up in this. Perhaps later I can get away. I don't see what anyone can do to you if you decide to leave the colony," Nancy went on. "Surely you're a free person." "Not anymore," her companion returned sadly. "I'm in it too deep now. I'll have to go on until fate helps me." "I wouldn't wait," Nancy advised bluntly. "Let me help you. Right now." Chapter 14. Disturbing Gossip. The strange woman in Nancy's car seemed to waver for a moment, as if about to accept the girl's offer to help. Then she shook her head. "No, I won't drag you into it," she said with finality. "You don't know what you'd be getting into if you helped me. Why, if they even learned that you've aided me in mailing this letter..." Nancy saw the woman shudder. For one fleeting instant she too felt
afraid of something she could not define. The young sleuth realized that the woman was trying to warn her of the danger. Nancy knew the wise thing to do was forget all about the nature cult and the strange things which apparently went on in the hillside cave. Yet she felt that she was on the verge of discovering an important secret. Nancy's companion was obviously relieved when the car rounded the bend and brought them within sight of the town. "If you'll just drop me off at the post office, I'll be most grateful," the woman said. "May I take you back with me?" Nancy asked. "I'll be returning in less than an hour." "No, I'll walk back." Nancy saw that it was useless to protest, and let the matter rest. She made no comment. After leaving her passenger in front of the post office, Nancy continued down the main street to the supermarket. Later, while she waited in the checkout line to pay for her groceries, two women took their places behind her. They were talking earnestly together and did not pay any attention to Nancy. She, in turn, did not notice them until one of the shoppers began to speak on a startling subject. "It beats me the way those people carry on," she heard one of them say. "You'd think Mrs. Bird would turn them out." Instantly, Nancy became alert. "I suppose she needs the money," the other woman responded. "But someone should speak to her about it. The idea of those folks capering about in bedclothes. They must be crazy." "That's just what I think," the first woman remarked. "If I lived near that farm, I wouldn't feel safe, and I don't think it's decent for a law-abiding community like ours to have folks like that around. I'm going to get a big group together and call on Mrs. Bird to tell her what we think of her." "I'll certainly join you," the woman said. Nancy felt the situation was becoming serious, that the criticism of Mrs. Bird would grow even sharper. If the two women carried out their threat, the consequences might be very unpleasant. Prospective Redgate boarders might change their minds. The colony might take reprisals. One thing is certain, Nancy decided. Our costumes must be ready by tonight, in case the colony members have a meeting. She paid for the groceries and went directly to the material shop, where she bought several yards of white muslin, then started for home. Driving back to Redgate Farm, Nancy kept a sharp lookout for the woman of the Black Snake colony, but she was nowhere along the road. I wish I could have talked to her more. It might have helped in my plan to attend the ceremony. Joanne, Bess, and George were just returning from the woods with their pails brimming over with luscious-looking berries when Nancy drove into the barnyard. As they started to help her carry out the packages, Carl Albert Jr. rushed gallantly from the house to assist. He glanced curiously at the soft, fat one which Nancy kept tucked under her arm, but she did not give any explanation of its contents. Besides, the elder Mr. Abbott and Mrs. Salisbury were within hearing distance. Immediately after a late lunch and some pleasant conversation with the guests, Nancy excused herself and summoned the other girls to her room, where they unwrapped the material and brought out scissors, needles, and thread. "We must work like mad," she said, "in case there's a meeting tonight." With great excitement and anticipation, she cut out the first costume, which was to serve as an entering wedge to the nature called ceremonial. As Nancy worked, she told the story of her adventure with her passenger and the conversation of the women in the market. Joanne was alarmed. "Oh, Graham must never hear of this," she exclaimed. "She'd be heartbroken." The others agreed. "We won't tell Mrs. Bird any more than we have to," George said. "I do hope we can solve the mystery before something ugly happens." For the next few hours, their needles flew flourishingly. At last, the costumes were finished. The four friends could not control their laughter as they tried them on. "You certainly look as if you're ready for Halloween." "You certainly look as though you're ready for Halloween," George told Nancy. "Do you think I'll pass?" "In the moonlight, they won't be able to tell you from a full-fledged member of the cult," Bess declared. "Let's see you go through the mystic rites." To the delight of her chums, Nancy danced around the room, waving her arms wildly and making weird moans. "Joe," a voice called, "dinner's ready." Startled, the girls scrambled out of the white robes and hastily hid them. They tried to compose their faces as they hurried downstairs, but merely succeeded in looking guilty. Seems to me you girls spent a long time locked up in your rooms," Mrs. Salisbury sniffed suspiciously. "Planning some kind of mischief, no doubt." Mr. Abbott wagged his finger playfully at the four girls. George had a hard time keeping a straight face and hastily took a sip of milk. Bess could not restrain a giggle, whereupon Mrs. Salisbury gave her a sharp look. "Humph!" she exclaimed. "I must say, I'll have you to agree with Mr. Abbott this time. I'm sure you four are up to some prank." Even Nancy and Joanne had to smother telltale grins. They only smiled pleasantly, but offered no explanation. Actually, the girls were so excited over their prospective adventure, they could scarcely do justice to the excellent meal Mrs. Bird had prepared. Carl Jr., as usual, was a charming companion. He had many amusing anecdotes to tell, and Nancy was happy to observe that Joanne seemed to be enjoying it all immensely. Indeed, by the time dessert was finished, Nancy and her chums realized that they had temporarily forgotten counterfeiters, syndicates, and even the nature cult on the hill. Everyone was sorry. A little later, when
the young man announced that he must leave.
I wish I could stay, he said regretfully, letting his eyes rest especially long on Nancy. But I must get back to the city tonight. I'll try to run down again in a few days to see your father. Take care of yourselves, he added to the girls. After Carl Jr. had gone, the girls were washing the dishes. George said teasily, "You can't tell me Father is the only attraction at Redgate Farm. He has his eye on Nancy!"
Silly. Nancy laughed.
"He scarcely took his eyes off of you all evening," George insisted. "You made quite a hit this morning with that rescued heroine bit."
Oh, honestly, George. Nancy blushed. You never give up, do you? Carl Jr. wouldn't be so bad, Bess added. But imagine having Mr. Albert for a father-in-law. You do the imagining, Nancy said, lightening. I'm going outside to look at the hillside. All the girls watched until late in the evening, but the mysterious place remained dark and deserted. Disappointed, the girls went to bed. They awakened early the next morning, for they had gradually become astonished to farm hours. They had gradually become accustomed to farm hours. When they learned from Mrs. Bird that Reuben was not feeling well, the girls eagerly helped with the various outdoor chores. It was noontime before they realized how much time had passed. You girls should have some relaxation this afternoon, Mrs. Bird said. How about a swim down in the brook? There's a spot that used to be known as the old swimming hole. It's fairly deep. That sounds wonderful, Bess declared. Joe declined. But at 2 o'clock, Nancy and Bess and George set off in bathing suits. For 2 hours they swam, floated, and sunbathed on the shore. Everyone in a while, Nancy and George would mention some angle of the colony. Hell syndicate or counterfeiting mysteries. But immediately Bess would say, "Shush! We're relaxing. We may have a big night tonight." Finally, the girls started for the farmhouse. To reach it, they had to cross a field in the corner of which lay a heap of large stones, apparently raked there when the acreage was cultivated. George grinned, climbed across the stones, saying, This life is making me rugged. Ow! Ouch! She cried loudly, then added, A snake! It bit me! Chapter 15. Masqueraders! Nancy and George turned just in time to see the brownish snake slither off in a wriggling motion and disappeared among the stones. Oh, George! Bess cried. Was it a poisonous one?
I'm not sure, she answered. I hope it wasn't a copperhead.
We'd better not take any chances, Nancy declared, wiping a handkerchief from her beach robe. Let's put on tourniquet. Is that tourniquet? No. Tourniquets? Are we sure that's not tourniquet? No. Tourniquets? I'm pretty sure it's tourniquet. Tourniquet, Bess. Like lightning, the girls tied their handkerchiefs tightly above and below the puncture marks, and made George's calf by the snake's fangs. Okay. Then Nancy took a tiny pair of scissors from her bag. I wish I had something to sterilize these with, she said. Will perfume do? Bess asked, and took some from her bag, the tiny bottle of blue jade. The liquid was poured over onto the scissors. Then Nancy deftly made the crisscross incision near the punctures. Blood splurted out, and with it she hoped any serum the snake might have injected. George stoically had not made a sound, but finally she said, "Thanks, girls. Your quick first aid probably made it possible for me to go to the ceremonies tonight, if they have them. I think you'd be better not to step on your foot or stimulate circulation," Nancy advised. "Suppose Bess and I carry you?" George started to protest, but finally consented. Seated on a chair made by the intertwined hands of Nancy and Bess, George was carried toward the farmhouse. The trip, though awkward and slow, went at a steady pace. George maintained her Spartan attitude. She not only refused to complain, but teasingly asked Bess, "Aren't you glad I don't eat as much as you do?" "I don't know what you mean," Bess replied, puzzled. "Well, if I love desserts as you do," George teased, "I wouldn't be such a featherweight to carry." Bess gave her cousin an indignant glance. "How do you like that for gratitude? Next time I lug you all the way home." Nancy interrupted with a grin. I guess we all do our share of eating dessert. Anyhow, we've made it. Girls, Redgate Farm is just ahead." As they came up to the house, Mrs. Salisbury, who was in the garden, exclaimed, "Oh, gracious, what happened?" Mr. Albert and Mrs. Bird hurried from the house. "Just a precautionary measure," Nancy explained, and told of the snake incident. George was carried indoors and laid on a couch, and Mrs. Bird quickly called the family physician. He arrived shortly and examined George's wound. The doctor nodded approvingly as he bathed it with an antiseptic and removed the tourniquets? Is that really how you spell tourniquet? I don't know. I've never seen the word. Tourniquets. But it would make sense if it was tourniquet.
but I'm just going what's right in front of me. Excellent first aid treatment, he announced. You'll be a fine young lady. I'd advise you to rest for several hours. Thank you. That's good news. George gave a relieved grin. For the remainder of the afternoon, she was made to lie inactive. When dinner time came, George got up, declaring, "I've never felt better." "But take it easy in case we go out tonight," Nancy pleaded with her. To allay suspicion on the part of the other boarders, Bess and Joanne were posted as guards across the road. If they saw the beginning of the rites on the hill, the girls were to give bird calls. In the meantime, Nancy and George waited in George's room, the costumes ready to be picked up at a moment's notice. Suddenly, Nancy leaped from her chair and flew into her own bedroom. "What's eating you?" George called. "Oh, why didn't I think of it before? How stupid of me," Nancy said, returning with a piece of paper in her hand. "What are you talking about?" George demanded. "That snake today, the way he wriggled. It looked just like the mark over the numeral 2 in the coded message," Nancy cried excitedly. The two, we think, means B." George sat up. "You mean the B with the wavy line over it might signify the Black Snake Colony?" "Yes. Oh, George, this connects the Hale Syndicate with the nature cult here. Now the message reads, Maurice, Hale calling Black Snake Colony meeting." "And the 18? What about that?" George asked. "Not too hard to guess, George. The 18 is the letter R, and could stand for Redgate Farm." "Nancy, you're a whiz!" As I've often told you," her friend declared. The young sleuth smiled and then said wistfully, "If I could only have had another second to copy the next few numbers, I might have known the exact time." "What happens now? Will you notify the police?" At that instant, Nancy and George heard soft bird calls. "No time to phone now," Nancy said. She grabbed 2 of the costumes and dashed for her room. George followed with the others as prearranged. The girls left by the kitchen door to avoid the boarders. Mrs. Bird had been told that the girls might go up the hillside to watch if the nature cult put on a performance. Nancy and George joined the other girls, and they scurried towards the woods. It was very dark beneath the dense canopy of trees, and Bess gripped Nancy's arm. Joanne was familiar with every path and led the way toward the hillside. A weird cry broke the stillness. Involuntarily, the girls halted and moved closer. "What was that?" Bess chattered. "Only some wild animal," Nancy assured her. "Come on," she urged. "We must hurry, or we'll miss the ritual." The girls went through the dark forest as fast as they could. The moon was rising, and the ghostly rays of light filtered through gaps
in the foliage overhead. A faint breeze stirred the leaves into what seemed like menacing whispers. The girls finally reached the river trail and followed it. "We must be careful now," Nancy warned in a low voice. "We're drawing near the colony. The cult may have a lookout stationed during the night ceremonies." "I hadn't thought of that," Joanne murmured. "I almost wish I hadn't come," Bess whispered nervously. "I had no idea it would be this dark." "What were you expecting?" "At 9:30 at night." George chimed in as low a tone as possible. "It will be lighter when the moon rises higher," Joanne told her. "Still, if you want to turn back—" "No! I'm going through with this masquerade, if the rest of you are," Bess retorted stalwartly. Nancy hoped fervently it would remain a masquerade. She was firmly convinced now that the Black Snake group were unscrupulous people working with, or at least friendly with, Maurice Hale. Nancy now felt convinced that the mystic rites were nothing but a sham. Unfortunately for Nancy's purpose, the hillside was covered with large rocks, as well as dense shrubs, which would provide temporary hiding places. As the girls stole cautiously up the steep path, they could see cult members still congregating. "We're in plenty of time," she thought. The girls separated, George and Bess crouching behind a huge rock. Joanne and Nancy took cover behind the heavy growth of shrubs and tall grass. For nearly 10 minutes the girls watched as the figures milled about the hillside. Then they heard the sound of cars approaching. "They must be coming up through the pasture," Joanne said, listening intently. An instant later, she and Nancy saw the headlights of 3 automobiles. "Look!" Joanne tugged at Nancy's sleeve. "More members are coming out of their tents." The 2 girls watched the white-robed figures walking slowly toward the brow of the hill. Where the 3 automobiles had parked. "I wonder if there are any newcomers." "I wonder if one of the newcomers is Maurice Hale," Nancy thought. She and Joanne were too far away to hear what was being said, but they could see distinctly. They watched as a group of men and women, 12 in number, stepped from the cars. Nancy could not distinguish any of their faces. The new arrivals quickly donned white garments and headgear similar to their outfits. Nancy and her friends had made then joined the other members of the cult. The ghostly figure soon began dancing about the moonlight, and Nancy felt that the time was right for her daring attempt to join the group. Before she could tell Joanne, there was a slight stir in the bushes next to her. Involuntarily, Nancy jumped, fully expecting to come face to face with one of the cult members. Instead, Bess and George emerged. "Isn't it about time we do something?" they asked almost simultaneously. "Yes," Nancy agreed. "We'd better get
into our robes as quickly as we can." The girls were well hidden by the rocks and bushes. They donned their costumes and pulled their headgear over their faces. And for the first time, Nancy noticed the scent of blue jade on Bess. I wonder if that was wise. Nancy thought, if it attracts attention to Bess, it might increase her danger. But it's too late to do anything about it now. As George overeager started off, Nancy caught her friend's arm. "Wait," she warned. "We must slip quietly into the circle, one at a time." "My knees are shaking now," Bess admitted. "I don't know how I will be able to dance." "Stay here if you like," Nancy told her. "I think we should leave someone to keep guard anyway." "I'll stay," Joanne offered. "I know the way back through the woods better than you girls do." "Come on," George pleaded. "If we don't hurry, we'll be too late." "Good luck," Joanne whispered as the girls crept away. Inch by inch, the three girls made their way up the hill. They crouched behind a clump of bushes, a stone throw from where the cult members were dancing. Nancy indicated that she would make the first move. Bess and George nodded. The slightest mistake will mean detection. Nancy thought, her heart pounding. Waiting for the right moment, she suddenly slipped out among the white-robed figures and instantly began waving her arms and making grotesque motions. Chapter 16. Startling commands. Relieved that her entry into the group had not been noticed, Nancy marched along with the other ghostly figures. If only George and Bess were successful. Nancy watched her disguised companions and saw that the girls would have no trouble following the motions, since each person was apparently making them up on the spur of the moment. So far, so good, Nancy told herself, satisfied now that her own position was temporarily secure. She tried to help her friends, deliberately moving toward the shrubs behind which George and Bess were hiding. She shielded them from the view of the cult members, all the time continuing her grotesque motions. George realized that the young sleuth was trying to do, and made the most of the opportunity. Choosing her time, she slipped out and joined the group on the hillside. Bess was more timid. Several times at the critical moment, she lost her nerve, but she finally managed to summon enough courage and make the plunge. "Keep close together," Nancy warned in an undertone. "If we lose each other, it may be disastrous." By this time, the girls had made up their minds that there was nothing the least bit mystic about the queer rites of the Black Snake colony. Disguised persons on all sides of them were making crude remarks which assured the girls that the cult members did not take the ceremony seriously. This ought to give the country yodels an eyeful, Nancy heard one man mutter. "How much longer do we have to do this?" Another grumbled. "I'm getting sick of flapping my arms like a windmill." This cult idea was all foolishness anyway, still another said. "Foolishness, is it?" Someone caught him up. Nancy thought she recognized the voice, but was not certain. Let me tell you, a girl was prowling around here only a few days ago. I guess the chief knew his business when he thought up this crazy cult idea. Well, enough of this. A loud voice answered. Nancy decided the man must be one of the leaders. We may as well go into the cave and get down to business. George was wondering what the girls had better do when Bess clutched Nancy's hand and whispered nervously, Do we dare enter? We must. Nancy returned quietly. The girls stood motionless, watching the white-robed figures march single file toward the entrance to the cave. Finally, Nancy signaled, and the three friends followed the group. Even though it occurred to them that they might be walking into a trap, Keep close behind me, Nancy warned her companions in a whisper. As they approached the mouth of the opening, Nancy saw a tall figure robed in white, standing guard. Her heart nearly stopped as she realized that each person was uttering some password. We're finished now, she thought. It was too late to turn back. The three girls could do nothing but hope in some way they might get past the stalwart guard. Nancy kept close to the person ahead of her, and as he muttered the password, she managed to hear it. Kamar. When Nancy's turn came to pass the guard, she spoke the word clearly. As she had hoped, George and Bess heard, and taking their cue from her, repeated the password. The sentry did not give them a second glance. Yet the girls breathed easier when they were safely through the entrance. The marchers descended into a cold, damp tunnel. Someone was carrying a torch at the head of the procession. But Nancy and her friends, who were near the end of the line, were in semi-darkness. What do you suppose we're getting into? George muttered. Nancy did not reply, but gave her friend a sharp nudge as a warning not to speak. A moment later, Bess tripped over some object in the path and would have fallen if Nancy had not caught her by the arm. They walked further underground and then unexpectedly stepped into a dimly lighted chamber. The members of the cult seated themselves on the floor, and the girls followed the example. Presently, they became aware of the strong scent of blue jade perfume. Bess was not the only one wearing it tonight. So there is a definite connection between this distinctive perfume and the Black Snake colony, Nancy thought. No wonder that man on the train was startled. Perhaps the woman used it. And he couldn't identify me, but took it for granted. I was one of the group. If so, it's just as well Bess has come on. Has someone. Nancy suddenly recalled the forged note bearing the blue jade scent. The woman who delivered it to me must be a member of this cult, she thought excitedly. After everyone had entered the room, the man who had given the sharp order outside the cave spoke again. He threw off his headgear and glanced over at the group appraisingly.
Nancy was stunned. Maurice. The man she had seen the first time she had stopped at the filling station. Is he Maurice Hale? She asked herself excitedly.
Everyone here, he demanded gruffly.
He counted the group, and again Nancy and her friends held their breath. Apparently some of the members were missing, for the leader did not notice the new recruits had been added to his organization.
We may as well get down to work, the leader announced. Sneed, do you have anything to report? At the question, one of the disguised persons stood up and threw off his mask. Again, Nancy was startled. He was none other than the man she had seen in room 305. Here's the good money, he said, handing over an envelope. Perfect score this time for our main distribution department. Very fine. Then nothing's gone wrong at your new office? Not yet, Chief, was the muttered reply. But yesterday I saw a boy hanging around the building. Looked like a plainclothes cop to me. I don't want you to think I'm backing out, but if you ask me, I'd say it's about time to blow. This game can't last forever, you know. I'll do the thinking for this outfit, the leader said scathingly. The leader scathingly retorted. We'll stay here another week and then pick a new spot. What makes you think the cops are wise? Well, they may have got wise to the fact that we're using Yvonne again. That's right. A shrill, angry female voice interrupted. Blame me. Every time somebody gets nervous, you bring me into it. Nancy could scarcely restrain herself. She had been right about Yvonne. The girl was mixed up in the Hale syndicate racket. You deserve blame, Al Sneed retorted irritably. First, you didn't have any more sense than to sell the bottle of that perfume to a perfect stranger. I told you that girl insisted upon buying it, and I was afraid if I flatly refused, she and her friends would get suspicious. Besides, I don't see what harm in it did to sell the perfume to a teenager. No, Sneed retorted sarcastically. You're so simple-minded you wouldn't see it might land us in jail. When Pete was on the train going to River Heights, he noticed the scent and thought that the girl was one of the chief's agents. Luckily for all of us, he saw his mistake before he spilled anything. Yvonne sputtered back in defense. Well, at least I phoned Al at his office right away so he could warn the agents about the stray bottle of blue jade. It's not my fault Pete happened to be on the same train as those girls. The leader suddenly became impatient. Enough of this, he shouted. It's not getting us anywhere. Sneed, I placed Yvonne in the office, and she'll stay there as long as I say. I'm satisfied with the rest of her work. Get me? Sneed nodded sully. Nancy had been studying the leader intently, and by this time was convinced that he was far more clever and intelligent than his subordinates. She figured that Al Sneed was right-hand man to the chief.
but resented his superior's favoritism toward Yvonne Wan. The organization was a large one, evidently changing its scene and type of operation from time to time. If only she could slip away and get help from the authorities. Another thing, Al Sneed continued, addressing Maurice Hale. We'd better make up a new code. Those girls might have been getting too close to our operation. Just might notify the cops. All right, the chief responded. I'll work one out in a day or two. He called on another member of the organization for a report. 200 packages passed, sir. Good, the leader exclaimed, rubbing his hands thin. Now, if you'll only follow me to the workroom, I'll give you each your cut and dole out the stuff for next week. Nancy and her friends could not have retreated had they wished, and certainly did not want to leave when they seemed so near the truth. But the situation in which they found themselves was foreboding one, and the very atmosphere of the room was tense and frightening. Boldly they followed the others into the adjoining chamber, which was brilliantly lighted with torches. Though prepared for the unexpected, the girls were taken completely aback at the sight which greeted their eyes. Chapter 17. Tense Moments. Nancy's first impression on entering was that the chamber appeared to be a cross between a printing shop and a United States mint. Counterfeiters, she thought excitedly. Hand presses stood about, and several engraved plates had been left on the table. Various chemicals and inks were in evidence. Neat stacks of paper, money lined one wall, and the other bills were scattered carelessly on the floor. Never in all her life had Nancy seen so much money. The room was cluttered with it. $20 bills appeared to be everywhere. Money still damp and was drying on tables. Nancy observed that all the bills seemed to be of the $20 denomination. At last she had the answer to so many questions which had been troubling her. This was the secret of the cave, the latest racket of the Hale Syndicate. The nature cult was a hoax. Its so-called mysterious rites used only as a screen to hide the work of a clever band of counterfeiters. The Black Snake Colony seemed to her to be a perfect name. Nancy realized that if she did not try to get away and bring help now, she and her friends would fail. There was nothing they could do by themselves. Nancy turned to relay her intentions to Bess and George. A slight tug on their robes was all that she needed to make them understand. But to put the plan into operation was another matter. The girls attempted to edge toward the chamber entrance by degrees, but Al Sneed stood barring the door. For the time being, escape was out of the question. They must bide their time. As long as some of the members of the organization remained masked, the girls knew they would be comparatively safe.
but already several people had stripped off their robes and headpieces. Every minute that the girls' escape was delayed increased the dangers of detection. Since it was impossible to sneak away, Nancy made careful note of her surroundings and tried to identify the faces on her mind, except for Yvonne, the leader, Maurice Hale, and Al Sneed, and the man she had seen on the train. All were strangers. 6 people besides Bess, George, and herself remained masked. Nancy surveyed the elaborate equipment in the workroom. She realized that this was an unusually large gang of counterfeiters. The engraved plate, which had been copied from an actual United States government $20 bill, was a work of art. Probably the leader of the gang had at one point been noted as a skilled engraver and had decided to use his talents to unlawful advantage. Nancy carefully glanced around the room. Maurice Hale was looking over some stacks of counterfeit money, while several members of the gang talked quietly. Bess and George automatically followed Nancy's gaze, but stood perfectly still next to her near the table. Nancy, under ordinary circumstances, could not have told the counterfeit money from the real thing. The picture of Jackson on the face, the White House on the back, but now that she had been alerted to examine the bills carefully, she noted that the color and the texture of the paper appeared to be at fault. When Nancy felt sure that she was not being observed, she stealthily picked up one of the bills and tucked it inside of her robe as evidence. "We made a pretty fair profit this week," Maurice Hale said gruffly as he stacked the bills into several large piles. "Your distributors and passers keep up like this for another month, and I'd say we'll all be on easy street." "The racket won't last another month," Al Sneed growled. "I tell you, the federal agents are getting wise. That's the phony stuff being passed around here." "Bah!" Hale replied contemptuously. "Let them be suspicious. They wouldn't think of this out of the way place as our headquarters in 1,000 years. Nancy could not help but smile at his words. That's what he thinks. The next voice that spoke startled Nancy. She recognized it instantly as belonging to Mr. Kent, the would-be buyer of Redgate Farm. "Yeah, maybe not," he was saying. "Still, it's too bad the old lady wouldn't sell her place. Then we'd really have a setup." It flashed through Nancy's mind that her hunch had been right about Mr. Kent being involved with the Hillside cult. No wonder they wanted to obtain Redgate Farm. It would have been a better headquarters for the gang than the cave. The girl detective strained her ears as the conversation continued. The woman next to Kent said scornfully, "I only hope your bright idea about that fake letter we took to the Drew girl and the cutting
of the farm telephone wires doesn't backfire. So, Nancy told herself, it was Kent and the woman who had just spoken who were the ones responsible for that part of the mystery. Mr. Kent also was undoubtedly the driver of the car which had slowed down one evening near the farmhouse. Meanwhile, the leader went on, deftly stacking the money. Nancy and her friends watched him with increasing uneasiness. When the various members of the organization were called upon to accept their share of the counterfeit bills, they would doubtless remove their masks. How would the girls escape detection then? Nancy realized the situation was becoming more serious, and she and her friends must escape before the actual distribution of the money began. If only Al Sneed would move away from the door. One thought comforted Nancy. Joanne was on guard outside the cave. If worse came to worse, and escape was cut off, Joanne undoubtedly would become alarmed and hurry back to the farmhouse for help. "We may have to make a dash for it," Nancy warned George in a whisper. "If that man moves away from the door, be ready." Al Sneed did not move, however, and it seems to the girls that he was watching them. They wondered if their whispering had made him suspicious. Bess trembled slightly and moved nearer to Nancy. Maurice Hale had finished counting money and glanced over the assembly and announced in a commanding voice, "Well, those of you who haven't removed your masks had better do it one by one. I want to be sure no one is here who shouldn't be." He pointed to Bess. "You first." Nancy and her friends felt themselves go cold. They were trapped. There was nothing they could do now but make a wild dash for safety. "Ready?" Nancy muttered under her breath. Before the girls could put their ideas into action, they were startled by a loud commotion in the tunnel. An instant later, the guard who had been stationed at the entrance of the cave burst into the chamber. He was half dragging a young girl who fought violently to free herself. The victim was Joanne. Chapter 18. Prisoners. Nancy's first impulse was to dash forward and try to help Joanne, but instantly she realized the foolishness of such an act. George half started toward Joanne, but Nancy restrained her. "Wait," she whispered tensely. If the situation had been grave before, it was even more serious now. With Joanne captured, there was no one to go for help. The girls must depend entirely on themselves to escape from the cave. No one at the farmhouse knew that they were doing anything more than watching the Black Snake colony from a safe distance. "Let me go!" Joanne tried, struggling to free herself. "Where did she come from?" Maurice Hale demanded unpleasantly. "I saw her coming among the bushes," the guard informed him. "She was spying, but she got just a little too curious." "Spying, eh?" A harsh expression crossed the leader's face. "Well, we know what to do with snoopers." "It's all a mistake," Joanne murmured on the verge of tears. "I didn't mean any harm. I'm Mrs. Bird's granddaughter, and I was merely curious to know more about the cult."
Even as Joanne spoke, her eyes traveled about the room, noting the stacks of money and the queer printing presses. She tried to show that she stood their significance, but it was too late. The leader had seen her startled expression. So, he drawled smartly, this is your time. This time, your curiosity has been the means of you getting into serious trouble. You'll learn by the time we get through with you not to meddle in the affairs that don't concern you. He turned quickly to Sneed. Al, see that no one leaves this room. Yes, Chief. The guard answered. Nancy wondered what he had in mind. Just then, Maurice continued in a cold, harsh voice. Just to make sure that other spies haven't been pulling fast ones on us, I'll have everyone remove his mask at once. Being mighty quick about it, too. No. Bess whimpered aloud. Then, realizing what she had done, she covered her mouth and sank back against the wall. All heads turned in her direction. Nancy and her friends had deliberately delayed in removing their masks, but now Nancy knew their effort to gain time was doomed. With Al Sneed still blocking the door, things looked black. Most of the others already had stripped off their headgear, in addition to Maurice Hale and Al Sneed. Nancy immediately recognized Yvonne Wan and Pete and the man who had spoken to her on the train. Next she spotted Mr. Kent, and finally the woman with the upswept hairdo who had brought her the fake letter. That woman's the same one I saw at the service station with the 3 men, Nancy thought. If she hadn't changed her hairstyle, I might have recognized her the night she delivered the note. The other unmasked members were strangers to Nancy. Tensely now, she watched as the leader stood before Bess. Nothing to be afraid of, dear, he said, and gently lifted off the ghostly head covering. The next instant, Maurice Hale practically shrieked, "A spy!" His face contorted with rage. Maurice snatched the white cloth headpieces from George's face, then Nancy's. Their scheme was exposed to all the members of the counterfeit gang. For an instant, there was stunned silence. Then angry cries arose from the Black Snake Colony members. They're the ones who bought the Blue Jade perfume from me, Yvonne Wan shrieked. Al Sneed glared at Nancy. Yeah, I knew something was wrong when you came into the office wearing the Blue Jade. I smelled it, but didn't let on. He then pointed accusingly toward Joanne. That girl is the one who applied at our city's office for the job. When she told me who she was and where she was from, I knew she was the last person in the world we'd want to hire. That crazy idea of yours about someone with farm experience, the leader cried. We didn't need anybody to talk to our agents about cows and chickens. But this place is in the country, Al Sneed defended himself. And in our codes we use a lot of that kind of lingo. Silence!
Maurice yelled, and turned to Joanne. So you thought you'd get a job at our office and spy on us? And your meddling friend Nancy Drew was in cahoots with you?
No! Oh no! Joanne cried out. It was only by accident. I wanted to find a job and help my grandmother. Nancy was just trying to help me locate the office.
Don't expect us to believe a trumped up story like that, the leader said harshly. We know all about why you two have been snooping around ever since Al had Pete trail you from Riverside Heights. What's more, we know how to deal with such people. Hale turned menacingly to Nancy. You'll wish you'd taken Pete's advice when he called your pal, indicated George, and warned her that you'd better mind your own business.
Oh, Maurice, please don't be too harsh with the girls, a timid voice pleaded. They didn't mean any harm.
She finished. The speaker removed her mask. Nancy turned quickly to see the woman she had helped in the woods and later had taken to town. So she's a counterfeiter, Nancy told herself, incredulously. I can't believe it. Didn't mean any harm, Maurice growled sarcastically. Oh no, of course not. They only wanted to land the whole Hale syndicate in jail. Not that you would care. If I had known what a whiner you are, I never would have married you. Mind your own business and let me take care of this.
In spite of the seriousness of their own situation, Nancy felt pity for the woman. Undoubtedly, as the wife of such a tyrant as Maurice Hale, she had stayed with him against her will. She had hated the life that she had been forced to lead, but evidently she had been powerless to escape from it. No wonder the poor woman took a chance and slipped away from time to time, Nancy thought. Frightened by the harsh words of her husband, Miss Hale moved back into a far corner of the room. Nancy wished she could help her in some way, but she realized that the woman dared not say more. What do we do with these girls? The leader demanded. We can't let them go. They know too much. On all sides, angry mutters arose. Yvonne Wan heartlessly proposed that the girls be tied up and left prisoners in the cave, but Maurice Hale ruled down that suggestion. We'll have to get 'em out of here, he said. They'll be missed, and a searching party might visit this joint. How about the shack at the river? It's in such a desolate spot. No one would think of looking there until after. He did not finish his sentence, but from the sinister expression on his face, Nancy and her friends guessed his meaning. He intended to lock them up in the cabin and leave them without food. A cry of anguish came from the leader's wife. Rushing forward, she clutched her husband frantically by the arm. Oh, Maurice, you can't be that cruel. Mr. Hale flung her away from him with a force that sent the woman reeling against the wall. She uttered a little moan of pain and sank to the floor. Oh! Bess screamed. Even the cult members were startled.
Be quiet,
ordered their chief. The cruel action aroused Nancy. For an instant, all eyes were centered on the woman, and Nancy thought she saw her opportunity. Quick as a flash, she made a rush for the exit. Bess and George, equally alert, darted for her. Al Sneed, who stood in the opening, was taken completely by surprise. He tried to hold his ground, but the girls were too strong for him. He managed to detain Bess and George, but Nancy wriggled from his grasp. She hesitated when she saw her friends had failed. "Go on, Nancy!" Bess shrieked. "You must escape!" Nancy darted into the next room, while George and Bess struggled with their captor, trying to block the door and give their friend more time. "Stop that girl!" Maurice Hale shouted angrily. "If you let her get away, y'all!" Nancy plunged into the tunnel and was swallowed up by darkness. She ran for her life and for the lives of her friends, realizing this was probably her only chance. The long white robe hindered behind her, but there was no time to tear it off. She held it high above her knees. Once she stumbled, but caught herself and rushed on frantically. The tunnel seemed to have no end. Behind her, Nancy could hear pounding footsteps and angry shouts. She thought the men must be gaining. If only she could reach the mouth of the cave. The tunnel would wound in and out of several times. Nancy brushed against the rough stone wall. The route was so circuitous that she began to think she had taken a wrong turn. Then, just as she was about to give up hope, Nancy spotted a dim light far ahead. She knew she must be nearing the mouth of the cave. No one appeared to be left guarding the entrance. Her only chance. In a moment more, she had reached the open air. "Saved!" Nancy breathed. At an instant, a dark figure loomed up from the grass. Nancy felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. Chapter 19. Destroyed Evidence. "Not so fast!" The man leered as he clutched Nancy firmly by the arm and whirled her around. "What's the big rush, anyway?" Nancy stared into his hard face, saw that the man who had been addressed as Hank, one of the three men she had seen at the filling station. Frantically, she struggled to free herself. "So," he muttered in satisfaction, "the pretty blonde spy the boys were telling me about. I thought you were warned by the guards to keep away from here. This time, I take it you're looking for something besides a stray cow." "Yes, and I'm going to find it," Nancy said bravely. "Oh, yeah? You're looking to find what? The police?" Hank looked at her costume. "You're a spy! But your little game is up." Nancy's pulse was racing. How could she get away? She could hear running footsteps coming through the tunnel and knew her chance of escape would be over in another instant. In desperation, she tried to jerk herself free from Hank, but her captor gripped her more securely and laughed as she cried out in pain. "Let me go!" Nancy twisted and squirmed, but her efforts
only made Hank tighten his grip. By the time the others reached her, she had given up the struggle and stood quietly, waiting for the worst to come. "Good thing you got her, Hank," Maurice Hale called. "What a little wildcat. We'll give her a double dose for this smart trick. No girl's going to put anything over me." At the entrance of the cave, it was nearly as bright as day, for the moon was high. Maurice Gale glanced nervously about, as though fearing observation by unseen eyes. "Get back inside," he sharply ordered his followers. "It's a clear night, and some wise bird might see us without our costumes and wonder what's up. We must destroy the evidence as quickly as we can and clear out this place." Even as the leader spoke, Nancy thought she heard a rustling in the nearby bushes. She told herself that it probably was only the wind stirring leaves. Rescue was out of the question, for no one knew that she and her friends had planned such a dangerous mission. How foolish of them not to have revealed their full plans to someone. Nancy made no protest and was dragged back into the cavern. Bravely, she tried to meet the eyes of her friends, for she saw that they were even more discouraged than she. Poor Bess was trembling with fright. The perfume did it!" she wailed. "I knew this masquerade was far too dangerous for us to try." "Cheer up," Nancy whispered encouragingly. "We'll find a way to get out of here." Bess only shook her head. She was not to be deceived. "And to think I was the one who couldn't wait for a spooky adventure on the hillside?" George moaned regretfully. "I really ought to have my head examined." The members of the syndicate were furious. There would be no second opportunity for these intruders to break away. At an order from the leader, Al Sneed found several pieces of rope and bound Nancy and her friends hand and foot. He seemed to take particular delight in making Nancy's bonds cruelly tight. "I guess they'll hold you for a while," he grinned, gloating over the girl's predicament. "Get to work," the leader commanded his men impatiently. "Do you think we got the rest of the night? If we don't hurry and get out of here, the cops are apt to be down on us. Don't know what this girl's done." All colony members except Mrs. Hale went to work with a will. The fear of the law obviously had affected them. With a sinking heart, Nancy realized the men planned to destroy all of the evidence of their counterfeiting operations. The machines that we can't take with us will wreck, Maurice Hale ordered. "If we save the plates, we can start up again in a new place. Get a move on." He stood over the men, driving them furiously. His wife had slumped down in the chair and had buried her face in her hands. She appeared crushed. Only once had she summoned her energy to speak. "Maurice," she murmured brokenly,
Why won't you give up this dreadful life? Always running from the police. We were happy before you got mixed up with such bad company."
Her husband cut her short with a sarcastic remark. She did not try to speak again, but sat hunched over, looking sorrowful at the girls. Nancy knew that she wanted to help them, but did not have the courage for further defense. The work of destroying the counterfeiting machinery went on, but several times Maurice Hale glanced impatiently at his watch.
"No use waiting until we're through here," he observed after a time. "Let's get the prisoners out of here pronto. The sooner we get rid of them, the safer I'll feel. Al, you start on ahead with one of the automobiles. You know the way to the shack, don't you?"
"Sure," Al Sneed agreed promptly.
"Then take Hank along to keep guard and get along."
Nancy and her chums were jerked to their feet. The cords around their ankles were removed to permit them to walk, but their arms were securely tied behind them.
"Move along,"
Al Sneed ordered Nancy, giving her a hard shove forward. The girls stumbled along through the dark passageway from the inner room to the mouth of the cave. Men and women followed them, angry, menacing threats. Al and Hank pushed the girls to make them hurry. Nancy and her friends exchanged hopeless glances from time to time. George held her head up contemptuously, but Joanne was white as a sheet, and Bess was on the verge of tears.
"I guess this'll teach you girls to mix with the Black Snake Colony," a raucous voice said as the group made its way toward the exit. Nancy held back a retort, but her icy look told the man she did not appreciate the remark. Their walk seemed interminable. Finally, however, moonlight could be seen. In a moment they were approaching the mouth of the cave. Nancy took a few halting steps and then paused, as if she had turned to stone. Her eyes were riveted upon the entrance. There stood Mr. Albert's son, Carl Jr. "Oh, Carl!" Nancy cried out. "These men are counterfeiters! Don't let them capture you too! Run!" Chapter 20. The Final Hunch. Carl Albert did not run. Instead, he signaled his hand. At once, 7 armed men sprang from the darkness of the nearby bushes. "Secret Service agents," Carl explained. "Quickly, to the girls!" "Stand where you are!"
"Stand where you are! Nobody! Don't move! Anyone!" ordered one of the federal men. So unexpected was their arrival that the counterfeiters were stunned. For an instant, no one moved. Then, with a cry of rage, Maurice Hale darted into the cavern. He had only taken a few steps when one of the other agents grabbed him firmly by one arm. "None of that! We have you right this time." Hale
You won't try any funny stuff with Uncle Sam again.
Some of the counterfeiters who had not yet come from the caverns had turned back. They'll get away through the other exit, Nancy cried out.
Carl smiled. We have that covered too.
He now introduced the 4 girls to the Secret Service agent Horton, who was in charge of the group. The federal man gave Nancy Drew a quick word of praise for revealing the headquarters of the counterfeiting ring.
Outwitted by that snooping kid! Snooping kid!
Maurice Hale screamed. The thought seemed to unnerve the man completely. He did not protest when handcuffs were put on his wrists. Other members of the syndicate submitted to the agents without resistance, although Yvonne Wan vehemently protested her innocence. I didn't know what it was all about until tonight, she cried angrily. It isn't fair to arrest me. I've worked for Mr. Sneed only a few days.
You'll have to think up a better story than that, she was told bluntly. Your name has been mixed up in underhand deals before, but this is the first time we've been able to get any evidence against you.
While the prisoners were being rounded up, Carl Albert rushed over to the girls and quickly freed their hands.
Are you all right?
He asked anxiously. Yes, Nancy told him. But if you hadn't arrived just when you did, it might have been a different story. She was on the verge of asking what had brought him to the cave at the psychological moment when she saw that 2 federal agents were placing handcuffs on the wrists of Maurice Hale's wife. Breaking away from her friends, Nancy darted to the other side of the room. "Oh, don't arrest her, Mrs. Hale," she pleaded. "She isn't like the rest. She tried to save us, but they wouldn't listen to her."
Sorry, Horton returned, but we'll have to take her along. If you want to intercede for her later, we may be able to have her sentence lightened.
After the prisoners had been herded out of the cave to waiting government automobiles and printing plates used in the making of counterfeit bills had been collected, Nancy felt explanations were in order from Carl. "How did you know we had come here?" Nancy asked him.
From Mrs. Bird. She was greatly worried. When I came to see Father tonight, she told me that after you'd gone, she found evidence of your costume making. She confided in me you might have done just what you did. She asked me to try to stop you.
"Yes, go on," Nancy urged.
Well, I've been suspicious of this hillside ceremony stuff, and after talking further with Mrs. Bird, I decided to get in touch with the Secret Service men. She said you had told her about. They couldn't come, but the chief agent in this area sent some of his other men.
"How marvelous of you to have put 2 and 2 together," Bess exclaimed.
By the time we all got here, Carl went on, no one was around. I sneaked inside just as all of you were coming out. Mr. Horton, Mr. Horton thought you girls would not be harmed if you walked outside before the gang was captured." "Thanks for that," said George. "I've had enough."
Just then, Secret Service Agent Horton came over to Nancy's group and extended his hand to her.
"Miss Drew," he said earnestly, "I want to thank you for your work, which has resulted in the solution of one of the most baffling cases of counterfeiting the United States government has ever had. How did you do it?"
Nancy blushed at the praise. "It was sort of a chain reaction, I guess," the young sleuth replied, and told of the various circumstances that had led to tonight's adventures. When she finished, the agent shook his head in amazement. "You cracked the code this gang had thought was unbreakable. My congratulations." It was late when the four girls escorted Carl Albert left the cave. It was late when the four girls, escorted by Carl Albert, left the cave. As they neared the farmhouse, Joanne observed that the lights were on. "I hope Graham hasn't been too worried." Before the girls reached the porch, Mrs. Bird hurried to warn them. She clung tightly to Joanne for an instant. "I'm so glad you're back," she murmured in relief. "And you girls are all right. I was so terribly afraid those members of the Black Snake Colony—" She was interrupted by Mr. Salisbury's voice from the back Mrs. Salisbury's voice from the back porch. "You had us so worried we couldn't go to bed. The idea of girls running around the country at this hour. The nature cult is all foolishness anyway." "Absolutely," Mr. Albert agreed. The less you meddle with the affairs, the wiser you'll be." "You're wrong this time, Father," Carl Jr. announced. "If the girls hadn't meddled, those counterfeiters would have operated indefinitely." "Counterfeiters!" the two boarders and Mrs. Bird exclaimed together. They were tense as Carl Jr. related everything that had happened. In fact, it was not until the next day that Mrs. Salisbury recovered from the shock significantly to boast. "Well, I always said those girls were up and coming." Mr. Albert was very proud of the part his son had played in the case, and said so many times. Mrs. Bird had nothing except praise for Nancy and her friends. "And who would think," she said, incredulously, "that Bess's innocent purchase of a bottle of perfume would lead you girls to a mystery right here at Redgate Farm?" However, the removal of the Black Snake Colony from her property left a serious financial problem. "I'm glad they're gone," she said, "but I'll miss the money. I can't hope to rent the land again. It isn't feral enough for farming. All this talk about counterfeiters is apt to give Redgate a bad name, too. I'll probably lose those other boarders who are coming. Publicity is a queer thing," Nancy said thoughtfully. "Sometimes one can work it to one's advantage. That's what we'll do now." "How?" Joanne asked. "We'll advertise that counterfeiter's cabin to sightseers and make enough money to lift
the dozens of mortgages. The other girls were enthusiastic. During the next week, the girls, with Carl Jr.'s assistance, placed in the cave for public display an imitation setup of the counterfeiting operation. There were several old printing presses and some dummy figures arranged before them as if at work. Scattered about the cave floor were stacks of homemade money to represent counterfeit bills. The following week, Mr. Drew came to Redgate Farm. A few miles away, he halted his automobile at the side of the road and, with an amused smile, studied a large billboard which read, "Follow the arrow to the Redgate Farm. See the mysterious cavern used by counterfeiters. Admission 50 cents. As Carson Drew continued slowly in his car, he presently came to another sign bolder than the first. Regan Health at Redgate Farm. Boarders by day or week. The traffic was unusually heavy, and the lawyer soon realized that all the cars were headed for the farm. The place was crowded. He parked as near the house as he could and walked up the path. The grounds were well kept and equipped with swings and huge umbrellas. A number of persons, evidently boarders, were enjoying the garden. Before Carson Drew had reached the front door, it was flung open and Nancy rushed to meet him. "Dad!" she cried joyfully. "Isn't this wonderful?" "You've done a magnificent job, Nancy." After a hearty dinner, Nancy and her friends took Mr. Drew into the hillside cave. Reuben Ames looked most unlike himself in a new suit, which was a trifle too tight, was in his glory as he conducted groups of visitors through the caverns.
"I've collected $30 already today."
He hailed Nancy as she came up with her friends. "This beats blowing corn." "This beats plowing corn." Bess grinned. Didn't I always say that adventure follows Nancy around? And Bess was right, for another exciting adventure awaited her courageous friend, who very soon was to become involved in The Clue in the Diary. Mr. Drew laughed. "Nancy," he said, "as I think of your adventure at Redgate Farm,
I hope you guys enjoyed
can't
that
decide
dramatic
whether
reading of
you're
Nancy
better
Drew and
as
the
a
Secret of
detective
Redgate.
or a promoter."
Almost said mansion. It's farm. It's not mansion. There's no mansion in this book. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that dramatic reading because I really had fun doing it and like taking the pictures. I still have to edit it right now, but yeah. So I'm probably gonna do a two-parter as it stands now, just because it's so long and I don't want to overwhelm my editing software and I don't want to overwhelm my laptop and I don't want to overwhelm YouTube. So yeah. And if you like this dramatic reading, and if you think I should wear this Nancy Drew inspired outfit, or I guess you could call it a costume, but it's not really a like I would add more pieces to this if it were like a costume personally. But if you think I should wear this for Halloween, be sure to give this video lots of likes and shares, because whichever video that is costume related has the most views by Halloween, that is what I will be for Halloween. And as it stands now, it looks like I'm gonna be a black cat. So yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.